I remember exactly where I was standing when my mother-in-law said those words that changed everything. It was at my nephew's birthday party in Millbrook Heights, the kind of sprawling suburban backyard where the Harrington family gathered every few months to celebrate milestones and pretend we were all one big happy family. You know the scene: string lights hanging between oak trees, a buffet table groaning under the weight of homemade casseroles and store-bought desserts, and those uncomfortable plastic chairs that leave marks on the back of your thighs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole extended family was there that warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. My husband Marcus's siblings, their spouses, their perfectly behaved children who somehow never seemed to spill anything on their clothes. Everyone was laughing, drinking sweet tea from mason jars, and celebrating little Tommy's acceptance into the elite Riverside Academy prep school. And there, holding court in her usual spot near the dessert table, was Eleanor Harrington, Marcus's mother, the family matriarch who wore her disapproval of me like expensive perfume. She always commanded attention at these gatherings, dressed in her signature pearls and cardigan despite the heat, telling stories about the good old days when the Harrington name meant something in this town. When men worked honest jobs and women knew their place. When family values weren't just words, people threw around but principles that guided every decision. She had this way of making even casual conversations feel like pop quizzes about whether you belonged in the family. I was balancing a paper plate loaded with potato salad and barbecue, trying to navigate through clusters of relatives while keeping an eye on my daughter, Sophia. At 17, Sophia had this quiet intensity about her, the kind of focused determination that made adults uncomfortable because they couldn't quite figure her out. She wasn't like her cousins who chattered constantly about boys and social media. She was different, thoughtful, brilliant in ways that made me proud and terrified at the same time. That afternoon, she was sitting alone on the porch steps, probably working on one of her scholarship applications or reading another book about international law. She'd been carrying around this worn copy of Just Mercy for weeks, making notes in the margins with the same careful handwriting she'd had since she was 8 years old. While her cousins were taking selfies by the pool, Sophia was quietly building a future that none of them could even imagine. I was genuinely happy for Tommy and his prep school acceptance. Really, I was. But I couldn't stop thinking about how Sophia's achievements seemed to disappear into the background at these family events. She'd just been accepted to 5 universities, including her dream school, Georgetown, where she planned to study international relations and human rights law. She'd worked 3 part-time jobs to help with application fees, spent her weekends volunteering at the Immigrant Resource Center, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while taking every AP class her school offered. But somehow, her acceptance letters never got mentioned in the family newsletter Eleanor sent out every month. Her academic awards never made it into the photo albums that got passed around during dessert. It was like watching someone try to make my daughter invisible in real time, and I'd been quietly tolerating it for years, because that's what you do when you marry into a family that sees you as an outsider. So when Eleanor raised her glass of sweet tea and started one of her toasts about how proud she was of Tommy's bright future, how wonderful it was to see the Harrington legacy continuing through another generation, I thought maybe this was my moment. Maybe I could casually mention Sophia's Georgetown acceptance, her scholarship opportunities, her plans to change the world one case at a time. I walked over with my plate, wearing my best daughter-in-law smile, the one I'd perfected over 18, years of trying to fit into a family that measured worth by old money and older traditions. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice light and friendly, "isn't it exciting that both Tommy and Sophia are heading off to such amazing schools? I was wondering if Sophia might be able to get some help from the family education fund that you mentioned last Christmas." The question seemed innocent enough. After all, Eleanor had spent months talking about this fund she'd established to help family members with college expenses. She'd mentioned it during holiday dinners, bragged about it to her bridge club, even had Marcus's brother David draw up official-looking documents that made it seem like some kind of family foundation. Eleanor didn't even look up from her plate. She just shook her head with the kind of casual dismissal you'd give to someone asking for directions to a place that doesn't exist. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of Southern politeness that cuts deeper than any insult. "That fund is for real Harrington grandchildren. You know, the ones who actually carry the family name and understand what it means to uphold our traditions." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what made it worse was how easily she said them. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like my daughter, who shared Marcus's DNA, who called Eleanor grandma, who'd been part of this family since she was born. Wasn't really family at all because I'd kept my maiden name when I married Marcus, and we'd given Sophia a hyphenated last name. I felt something crack inside my chest, not because I hadn't heard worse from Eleanor over the years, but because of how matter-of-fact it was, like she was commenting on the weather, or the quality of the potato salad. Like Sophia's worth was just obviously less than her cousin's, and everyone should understand that simple fact. But what Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my daughter had been preparing something special for graduation day. Something that would show them exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Something that would make them see her not as an outsider's child, but as exactly who she'd always been. Extraordinary. And when that moment came, when Sophia stood up in front of the entire school as valedictorian and delivered the speech that would change everything, I knew Eleanor Harrington would finally understand that being a real Harrington had nothing to do with a name and everything to do with character. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened on graduation day, you need to know the whole story of how we got there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You have to understand the Harrington family to truly grasp what happened that day at Tommy's party. They're what people in Millbrook Heights call old money, though if you dig deep enough, you'll find that their fortune came from Marcus's great-grandfather, who struck it rich in the textile business back in the 1940s. But 3 generations later, Eleanor had transformed that history into something that sounded like aristocracy. The Harrington family gatherings weren't just casual get-togethers, they were productions. Eleanor orchestrated every detail, from the monogrammed napkins to the seating arrangements that somehow always managed to place certain family members closer to the important conversations. There was an unspoken hierarchy at these events, and everyone knew exactly where they stood. At the top, naturally, was Eleanor herself, 82 years old, sharp as a tack, and wielding her checkbook like a scepter. She'd raised 4 children who all lived within a 20-minute drive of the family estate, and she expected them to show up for every birthday, anniversary, and holiday celebration she deemed worthy of her attention. Missing a family gathering wasn't just rude. It was practically grounds for excommunication. Then came Marcus's siblings, each one perfectly molded in Eleanor's image of what successful Harrington children should be. There was David, the eldest, who ran the family's investment firm and lived in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. His wife Patricia was everything Eleanor wanted in a daughter-in-law. Blonde, well-bred, and devoted to charity work that photograph well for the society pages. David and Patricia's children were the golden grandchildren. Tommy, now 17, and heading to Riverside Academy, had that easy confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. His sister Caroline was captain of her school's equestrian team and already had her debutante ball planned for the following spring. They called Eleanor grandmother, with the kind of formal respect that made her beam with pride. Then there was Marcus's sister Jennifer, married to a successful surgeon named Robert. They lived in the second-largest house in the neighborhood and had produced 2 children who excelled at tennis and piano recitals. Jennifer had never worked a day outside the home, which Eleanor praised as understanding the importance of family priorities. Marcus's younger brother Christopher rounded out the sibling trio. He'd married his college sweetheart, a sweet woman named Angela, who taught elementary school and brought homemade brownies to every family gathering. Their twin daughters were 12 and already showing signs of the Harrington perfectionism, winning spelling bees and science fairs with clockwork, regularity. And then there was Marcus, my Marcus. The youngest son who'd gone to law school on scholarships, built his own practice from nothing, and had the audacity to marry a woman who kept her maiden name and worked as a social worker at the county courthouse. Eleanor had never quite forgiven him for either decision. I still remember the first time Marcus brought me to a family dinner 18 years ago. I was 25, fresh out of graduate school, and completely unprepared for the interrogation that passed for conversation at Eleanor's dining room table. Where was I from? What did my father do for a living? Did I understand the responsibilities that came with being part of a family with such deep community roots? The fact that my father was a mechanic and my mother cleaned houses didn't seem to impress anyone. The fact that I'd worked my way through college waiting tables and graduated summa cum laude didn't seem to matter either. What mattered was that I didn't fit their predetermined mold of what a Harrington wife should be. When Sophia was born, I thought maybe things would change. Surely Eleanor would soften toward her first granddaughter, this beautiful baby who had Marcus's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. But even as a toddler, Sophia was different from her cousins. While Tommy and Caroline played dress-up with designer clothes, Sophia preferred building elaborate structures with blocks and asking endless questions about how things worked. At family gatherings, the differences became more pronounced each year. The other grandchildren would perform on cue. Piano recitals, poetry readings, little speeches about their accomplishments that Eleanor would record on her phone and send to all her friends. Sophia, even at 7 or 8, seemed to sense that these performances weren't really about celebration. They were about proving your worth, earning your place, demonstrating that you deserved the family's investment. So Sophia would sit quietly during these displays, usually with a book in her lap, observing everything with those intelligent eyes that made adults uncomfortable. Eleanor interpreted this as antisocial behavior, but I knew better. Sophia wasn't antisocial. She was analytical. She was watching and learning and forming her own conclusions about the world around her. The college fund Eleanor mentioned wasn't just money. It was a symbol of belonging, of being worthy of investment. She'd established it with great fanfare when Tommy turned 15, announcing at Christmas dinner that she wanted to ensure all her grandchildren had the best possible start in life. The fund would cover tuition, room and board, even study abroad, programs for any Harrington grandchild who met certain standards. Those standards were never explicitly defined, but the message was clear. Good grades weren't enough. Community service wasn't enough. Even being blood-related wasn't enough if you didn't fit the family image of what success should look like. Over the years, I'd watched Eleanor dote on her other grandchildren while treating Sophia like a pleasant but temporary guest. Birthday. Gifts were always smaller. Achievements were acknowledged with polite nods rather than genuine excitement. And Sophia's name somehow never made it into the family holiday newsletters that Eleanor sent to everyone in her social circle. Marcus tried to bridge the gap, but he'd been conditioned since childhood to avoid conflict with his mother. She just needs time to adjust, he'd say after particularly difficult family gatherings. She's old-fashioned, but her heart's in the right place. But I knew better. Eleanor's heart wasn't in the wrong place. It was working exactly as designed. She'd created a system where love and acceptance were earned through conformity, where being part of the family meant abandoning parts of yourself that didn't fit the Harrington brand. What she didn't realize was that in trying to diminish Sophia, she was actually creating something much more powerful than another compliant grandchild. She was raising a young woman who understood exactly what real strength looked like, what authentic achievement meant, and what it took to succeed without compromise. That day at Tommy's party, standing in Eleanor's perfectly manicured backyard, with her casual dismissal still ringing in my ears, I realized that the moment of reckoning was coming. Sophia's graduation was only 3 weeks away, and as valedictorian, she'd have a microphone, a captive audience, and something to say that would change everything. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory with surgical precision, moments so sharp and clear that years later you can still feel the exact temperature of the air, smell the specific combination of barbecue smoke and honeysuckle, hear the distant sound of children laughing while your world quietly shatters. Standing there in Eleanor's backyard, holding my paper plate with hands that had started to tremble, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The words hung in the humid air like smoke. That fund is for real Harrington grandchildren. Real Harrington grandchildren. As if my daughter, who had been coming to these gatherings since she was an infant, who had sat through countless family dinners and holiday celebrations, who had endured 17 years of subtle dismissals and coded rejections, was somehow an imposter. I looked across the yard to where Sophia sat on the porch steps, still absorbed in her book, completely unaware that her own grandmother had just declared her unworthy of the family's investment. She was wearing a simple sundress I'd bought her at Target, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, no makeup because she'd never seen the point in it. At 17, she had this ethereal quality that reminded me of old photographs, serious, thoughtful, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or trends. The contrast between her and her cousins couldn't have been more stark. Caroline was holding court by the pool, her designer swimsuit perfectly coordinated with her manicured nails, regaling a group of younger cousins with stories about her upcoming debutante ball. Tommy was showing off his tennis serve to his Uncle David, his movements confident and assured. Every inch the golden boy who'd never had to wonder if he belonged anywhere. "Honey, are you listening to me?" Eleanor's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp with the kind of impatience she reserved for people who weren't keeping up with her superior intellect. I said the fund has very specific guidelines. We can't just hand out money to anyone who asks for it. There are standards to maintain, traditions to uphold. I forced myself to look at her, this woman who had spent 18 years making me feel like a charity case welcomed into her family out of misguided kindness. She was standing with that familiar posture of authority, one hand on her hip, the other gesturing dismissively as if she were explaining something obvious to a slow child. "But Eleanor," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "Sophia is your granddaughter. She's been accepted to Georgetown. She's valedictorian of her class. She's a sweet girl," Eleanor interrupted, her tone taking on that particular quality that Southern women use when they want to deliver a cutting blow while maintaining plausible deniability. "But let's be realistic about what we're dealing with here. The family has certain expectations, certain standards that have been maintained for generations. We can't compromise those standards just because someone has good grades." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the words themselves, but the way she said them, like she was discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the potato salad. There was no malice in her voice, no anger or emotion of any kind. Just a matter-of-fact assessment of my daughter's worth that had apparently been decided years ago. "What standards?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "What exactly are you saying?" Eleanor sighed, the kind of patient exhale that suggested she was being very gracious by explaining something so obvious. "Well, for starters, there's the matter of her name. Sophia Rodriguez Harrington sounds so modern, don't you think? And then there's her interests. International law, human rights. These aren't practical career choices for a young woman. They're not the kind of pursuits that build stable families or contribute to community leadership." She paused to take a sip of her sweet tea, letting her words sink in before continuing. "And frankly, dear, we have to consider her background. Your background. The fund is designed to invest in young people who understand what it means to carry the Harrington legacy forward. That requires a certain foundation. As if my working-class upbringing was some kind of structural defect that had infected my daughter's DNA. As if the values I'd tried to instill in Sophia, compassion, justice, hard work, integrity, were somehow incompatible with being, real Harrington. I felt Marcus's presence before I saw him, the familiar warmth of his hand on my lower back as he joined our conversation. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice carrying that careful neutrality he always used when trying to navigate between his mother and his wife. "Oh, Marcus," Eleanor said, brightening immediately in the way she always did when one of her actual children appeared. "I was just explaining to your wife about the college fund guidelines. She seemed to think Sophia might be eligible, but of course that's not how these things work." Marcus's hand pressed slightly firmer against my back, a silent signal that he could sense the tension radiating from my body. "What do you mean, not eligible? Sophia's my daughter." Eleanor's laugh was light and dismissive, the kind of sound she made when someone said something charmingly naive. "Of course she is, darling, but the fund has very specific criteria. It's designed to support family members who will use their education to strengthen the Harrington name and contribute to our community standing. Sophia's interests are so international, so removed from what really matters here in Millbrook Heights." "She wants to be a human rights lawyer," Marcus said quietly. "She wants to help people." "I'm sure she does," Eleanor replied, her tone suggesting that wanting to help people was a quaint but impractical notion. "But we have to be realistic about return on investment. Tommy will be going into business, eventually taking over aspects of the family enterprises. Caroline will marry well and contribute to the social fabric of our community. Even little Emma and Grace have already shown aptitude for the kinds of activities that build proper connections." She gestured vaguely toward where Sophia still sat, reading, oblivious to the conversation that was determining her future. "But what will Sophia contribute? She'll go off to Washington or New York or wherever these international lawyers work, and we'll never see her again. The family investment will be completely wasted." The word wasted hit me like a physical blow. Wasted. As if my brilliant, compassionate, remarkable daughter was nothing more than a bad financial decision. As if her dreams of fighting injustice and protecting the vulnerable were just expensive hobbies that the family couldn't afford to indulge. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to say something, to defend his daughter, to push back against his mother's casual dismissal of everything Sophia had worked for. But he just stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd worn countless times over the years when faced with choosing between his mother's approval and his family's dignity. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should talk about this later. Later. Always later. Never now. Never in the moment when it mattered. Never when standing up might actually make a difference. Just later, when the damage was done and the wound had time to fester." Eleanor patted Marcus's arm with maternal affection. "Oh, sweetie, there's nothing to discuss. The guidelines are very clear, and they're designed to protect the family's interests. I'm sure you understand." She turned back to me with that smile that never reached her eyes. "I hope you're not too disappointed, dear. I know how important these things can seem to mothers. But sometimes we have to accept that not every child is destined for the same opportunities. Sophia is lovely, truly, but the fund simply isn't appropriate for her situation. Her situation, as if being my daughter was a medical condition that disqualified Sophia from receiving the same consideration as her cousins. As if the accident of my background had somehow contaminated my child's worthiness. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching Eleanor's face for any sign that she understood what she'd just done. But there was nothing. No recognition of the cruelty, no awareness of the pain she'd inflicted, no comprehension that she'd just told me my daughter wasn't good enough to be considered a real member of her own family. That's when I realized that this moment wasn't really about the money. It wasn't even about college tuition or study abroad programs or any of the practical benefits that the fund could provide. It was about something much more fundamental. It was about being seen, being valued, being considered worthy of investment, and love. And in that perfectly manicured backyard, surrounded by the sounds of family laughter and celebration, Eleanor Harrington had just told me that my daughter, our daughter, would never be worthy enough. To understand why Eleanor's words cut so deep that afternoon, you need to know that this wasn't the first time she'd drawn lines around who belonged and who didn't. This was just the latest in a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building for 18 years, ever since the day Marcus first brought me home and announced that he was serious about the girl from the wrong side of Millbrook Heights. Was 24 when we met, working 2 jobs to pay off student loans while pursuing my master's degree in social work. Marcus was in his final year of law school, clerking at a prestigious firm downtown, and we couldn't have come from more different worlds if we'd tried. He grew up in the colonial mansion on Magnolia Drive, complete with a circular driveway and gardens that required a full-time landscaping crew. I grew up in a duplex on Factory Street, where my mother Maria worked double shifts at the textile plant, and my father Jorge spent his days underneath car hoods at Rodriguez Auto Repair. The first time Marcus mentioned bringing me to Sunday dinner, I spent a week's wages on a dress I thought might make me look like I belonged. I practiced conversations in the mirror, rehearsed answers to questions I imagined Eleanor might ask, and convinced myself that if I just tried hard enough, I could bridge the gap between my world and theirs. That first dinner was a masterclass in polite rejection. Eleanor greeted me with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, the one I'd later learn was reserved for people she considered temporary fixtures in her children's lives. She asked all the right questions. Where did I go to school? What did my parents do? What were my career aspirations? But her tone suggested she was conducting an interview for a position that had already been filled. Social work, she repeated when I told her about my studies, pronouncing the words like they left a bitter taste in her mouth. How noble. And your parents, they must be so proud of your academic achievements. The way she said academic achievements made it clear that she'd already done her research. She knew about the scholarships, the work-study programs, the fact that I'd graduated magna cum laude despite working 30 hours a week throughout college. But instead of seeing these as accomplishments, she viewed them as evidence of my inferior starting position, proof that I'd had to work for things that came naturally to people in her social circle. Marcus, bless his heart, tried to navigate between his mother's thinly veiled disapproval and his genuine feelings for me. But I could see the conflict in his eyes every time Eleanor made one of her pointed comments about different backgrounds and compatibility concerns. He'd been raised to respect his mother's judgment, to value family harmony above all else, and challenging her meant risking the approval he'd spent his entire life earning. The pattern became clear over the months that followed. I was included in family gatherings, but always as an observer rather than a participant. Conversations would stop when I entered a room, then resume with careful politeness that excluded any references to people or events I wouldn't understand. Eleanor would introduce me to her friends as Marcus's friend, even after we'd been dating. For over a year, as if giving me a more permanent title might somehow make our relationship real. When Marcus proposed, I thought things might change. Surely becoming an official member of the family would earn me some measure of acceptance, some recognition that I belonged. But Eleanor's reaction to our engagement announcement made it clear that marriage was just a legal formality. It didn't change my fundamental inadequacy in her eyes. Well, she said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, I suppose we'll need to start planning a wedding. Nothing too elaborate, of course, given the circumstances. The circumstances, as if my background was a medical condition that required special accommodation. As if marrying her son was an act of charity that shouldn't be celebrated too enthusiastically. The wedding planning became a 6-month exercise in compromise that felt more like negotiation between hostile nations than joyful preparation for a celebration. Eleanor had opinions about everything: the venue, too flashy; the guest list, too many people she didn't know; the music, too ethnic; even my dress, too modern. Every suggestion I made was met with gentle but firm redirection towards something more appropriate for a Harrington family wedding. The final blow came when she insisted that the ceremony program list me as Maria Elena Rodriguez, daughter of Jorge and Maria Rodriguez of Factory Street. She claimed it was traditional to include parents' addresses, but I knew better. It was her way of ensuring that everyone present understood exactly where I came from and how far I'd traveled to reach their social circle. When Sophia was born, I convinced myself that becoming a grandmother would soften Eleanor's edges. Surely this beautiful baby, half Harrington by blood, would earn me some measure of acceptance through the undeniable bond of shared family. I was naive enough to believe that love could transcend social prejudice, that holding her first granddaughter in her arms would make Eleanor see me as something more than an unwelcome interloper. But even motherhood couldn't protect me from Eleanor's careful campaign of exclusion. She showered Sophia with gifts during those early years, but they were always presented as generosity toward her son's child, rather than genuine affection for my daughter. Every milestone was celebrated with the kind of conditional enthusiasm that made it clear this acceptance could be withdrawn at any moment. The hyphenated name became Eleanor's particular obsession. "Sophia Rodriguez Harrington is such a mouthful," she'd say repeatedly, as if the length of the name was the real problem rather than its bilingual composition. Wouldn't it be simpler to just use Harrington? After all, that's the family name that really matters. But I'd fought too hard to reach this point to erase my heritage for the sake of Eleanor's comfort. My parents had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they'd never had, and carrying their name was a way of honoring that sacrifice. If Eleanor couldn't accept that Sophia belonged to both worlds, then she'd never truly accept either of us. The subtle rejections accumulated over the years like paper cuts, individually small but collectively devastating. Birthday parties where Sophia was seated at the children's table long after her cousins had graduated to adult conversations. Christmas gifts that were thoughtful but noticeably less expensive than what the other grandchildren received. Family photos where Sophia was positioned at the edge of the group, as if the photographer wasn't quite sure she belonged in the frame. Each incident was small enough to seem like an oversight, isolated enough to make me question whether I was being too sensitive or reading too much into innocent moments. But when you string them together over 17 years, they form a clear pattern of exclusion designed to remind us of our place in the family hierarchy. The college fund announcement had been the cruelest trick of all. Eleanor had made such a production of establishing it, talking about her commitment to the next generation's success, her desire to give all her grandchildren the best possible start in life. She'd even had formal documents drawn up, complete with official letterhead and legal language that made it sound like a genuine family foundation. For 2 years, I'd watched Sophia work herself to exhaustion, maintaining perfect grades, volunteering at the community center, working part-time jobs to save money for college applications, all while believing that her academic achievements might finally earn her grandmother's recognition. I'd allowed myself to hope that this might be the moment when Eleanor would see past her prejudices and acknowledge my daughter's remarkable potential. Standing in that backyard, listening to Eleanor casually dismiss 18 years of hope with a few well-chosen words, I finally understood that this was never about Sophia's worthiness. It was about power, about maintaining control over who belonged and who didn't, about ensuring that the family's resources remained concentrated among the right kind of grandchildren. But what Eleanor didn't realize was that in trying to diminish my daughter, she'd actually created something much more dangerous than another compliant family member. She'd raised a young woman who understood exactly what it felt like to be underestimated, who knew the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege, and who had spent 17 years quietly preparing to prove that worth had nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts. What the Harrington family never bothered to notice about Sophia was that she'd been quietly building an extraordinary life right under their noses. While they were focused on tennis tournaments and debutante balls, while they were measuring worth by country club memberships and social connections, my daughter was creating something that would make their narrow definition of success look painfully small. From the time she was 8 years old, Sophia had this remarkable ability to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. While her cousins played with American Girl dolls, she was reading biographies of women who had changed history: Eleanor Roosevelt, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Dolores Huerta. She'd curl up in my bed on Sunday mornings, asking questions that made me scramble for answers. Why do some people get to make decisions for other people? What makes laws fair? How do you change something when the people in charge don't want it to change? By the time she was 10, she was writing letters to our local congressman about immigration policy. Not the cute, childish notes that parents help their kids compose for school projects, but thoughtful, researched arguments that quoted Supreme Court cases and international human rights treaties. Congressman Bradley's office started sending back personal responses rather than form letters, and his chief of staff once called to ask if Sophia might be interested in participating in a youth advisory panel. Eleanor never knew about any of this, of course. Family gatherings weren't places where Sophia felt safe sharing her real interests. She'd learned early that passion for social justice wasn't the kind of achievement that earned approval at the Harrington dinner table. So she'd sit quietly through conversations about golf tournaments and charity galas, keeping her real accomplishments to herself like precious secrets. At school, however, Sophia was becoming a force to be reckoned with. By freshman year, she'd already founded the Human Rights Club, which started with just 3 members meeting in an empty classroom after school. She spent her lunch periods researching current cases, creating presentations about refugee crises and voter suppression, organizing letter-writing campaigns to support legislation she believed in. Within 2 years, the club had 40 members and was collaborating with organizations across the state. Her teachers noticed immediately. Mrs. Patterson, her AP government teacher, told me during a parent conference that she'd been teaching for 30 years and had never met a student with Sophia's combination of intellectual rigor and genuine compassion. She doesn't just understand the concepts, Mrs. Patterson explained. She feels them. She sees every political theory and legal precedent as a tool that can either help people or hurt them, and she wants to make sure it's used for good. The summer before her junior year, Sophia applied for an internship at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Birmingham. I knew she wanted it desperately, but I also knew the competition would be fierce. College students from across the country applied for those positions, and they rarely selected high school applicants. When the acceptance letter arrived, Sophia stared at it for a full minute before she started crying. For 6 weeks that summer, she worked alongside some of the most brilliant legal minds in the country, researching hate crimes, analyzing voting rights cases, and contributing to reports that would influence national policy. Her supervisor, a Harvard Law graduate named David Chen, wrote her a recommendation letter that I still keep in my jewelry box. In 20 years of civil rights work, I have rarely encountered someone with Sophia's combination of analytical ability and moral clarity. She has the potential to be one of the great legal advocates of her generation. Eleanor never asked about the internship. When Sophia returned home that August, glowing with excitement about the work she'd done and the people she'd met, the family, dinner conversation focused entirely on Tommy's performance at tennis camp and Caroline's writing lessons. Sophia tried once to share a story about meeting a federal judge who specialized in immigration law, but the conversation quickly shifted to Jennifer's new kitchen renovation. That's when I started keeping a private record of everything Sophia accomplished, because I realized that if I didn't document it, her achievements would disappear into the vacuum of family indifference. The award she won for her essay on environmental justice, the scholarship she earned to attend a constitutional law seminar at Georgetown, The recommendation she received from a federal appeals court judge who'd been impressed by her questions. During a courthouse visit, senior year brought an avalanche of recognition that would have made any normal family burst with pride. Sophia was selected as one of 30 students nationwide to participate in the Congressional Student Leadership Conference, where she spent a week in Washington working directly with members of Congress on pending legislation. She won first place in the statewide high school mock trial competition, arguing a complex case about Fourth Amendment rights with the kind of poise that made veteran attorneys take notice. When the acceptance letters started arriving, even I was stunned by the scope of her success. Georgetown, her dream school, offered her a partial scholarship and guaranteed admission to their law school upon completion of her undergraduate degree. Northwestern offered a full academic scholarship, plus a stipend for living expenses. Duke invited her to join their special program for students interested in human rights law, with the opportunity to spend a semester studying at their campus, in Geneva. But perhaps the most remarkable letter came from Harvard Law School itself. The dean had somehow heard about Sophia's work through her Southern Poverty Law Center supervisor and wrote personally to encourage her to apply for their undergraduate program, with the understanding that she would have a guaranteed spot in their law school if she maintained certain academic standards. A guaranteed spot at Harvard Law, something that even Eleanor's most accomplished friends' children couldn't claim. I wanted to shout about these achievements from every rooftop. In Millbrook Heights, I wanted to call Eleanor and read every acceptance letter aloud to force her to acknowledge that her not-quite-worthy granddaughter had accomplished more at 17 than most people do in a lifetime. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Eleanor had already decided who Sophia was, and no amount of evidence would change her mind. What hurt most was watching Sophia navigate this success alone. Her cousins had parents who bragged about every small accomplishment, grandparents who saved newspaper clippings about honor roll achievements and soccer victories. Sophia had me, cheering her on from the sidelines. But she also had the burden of knowing that her greatest triumphs would never be celebrated by the people whose approval she'd unconsciously been seeking her entire life. The night she was selected as valedictorian, I found her in her room staring at the official notification letter. She wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating, just sitting quietly with that thoughtful expression she'd worn since childhood when she was processing something complicated. "Are you okay, baby?" I asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. She looked up at me with those dark eyes that had always seemed too old for her face. "Do you think they'll come to graduation?" The question broke my heart, because I knew she wasn't really asking about attendance. She was asking whether finally, after 17 years of quiet achievement and persistent excellence, she might earn the recognition she'd never stopped hoping for. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'll be there, and I'll be proud enough for everyone." She nodded, but I could see the sadness behind her composure. Despite everything she'd accomplished, despite the scholarships and awards and recognition from people who mattered in ways Eleanor couldn't even comprehend, part of Sophia still wanted her grandmother to see her clearly, to acknowledge her worth, to admit that she'd been wrong. What Sophia didn't know yet was that graduation day would give her something far more valuable than Eleanor's belated approval. It would give her the chance to define herself on her own terms, to speak her truth to a room full of people who had spent years underestimating her, and to demonstrate that real power doesn't come from inherited privilege. It comes from the courage to stand up and be counted when it matters most. The girl they'd dismissed as not quite Harrington enough was about to show them exactly what she was made of. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, while I was organizing case files at the courthouse, and Sophia was at her after-school volunteer shift at the Immigrant Resource Center. Principal Morrison's voice on the phone carried an excitement that made me stop what I was doing and give him my full attention. "Mrs. Rodriguez Harrington," he began, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I have some extraordinary news. The valedictorian selection committee has made their final decision. And I'm thrilled to inform you that Sophia has been chosen to deliver the commencement address for this year's graduating class. I sat down heavily in my desk chair, the weight of what he was saying hitting me all at once. Valedictorian. Not just the highest GPA in her class, but the honor of speaking to the entire school community, of having a microphone and a captive audience, and the chance to say whatever she wanted to say to everyone who had ever known her. The committee was unanimous, Principal Morrison continued. Her academic record is impeccable, of course, but what really set her apart was her essay submission. She wrote about the responsibility that comes with privilege, about using education as a tool for justice rather than just personal advancement. It was remarkable. Mature beyond her years and incredibly moving. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office for several minutes, just processing what this meant. For 4 years, I'd watched Sophia navigate high school with the quiet determination of someone who understood that she had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. She'd maintained perfect grades while working part-time jobs, volunteered countless hours while her cousins spent their weekends at country club events, and pursued her passion for justice while they focused on building social media followings. And now, finally, she was being given the platform she deserved. Not just recognition, but a voice. A chance to speak her truth to an audience that included every teacher who'd watched her excel, every classmate who'd witnessed her integrity, and most importantly, every family member who'd spent years acting like she was somehow less than worthy of their investment. When I picked Sophia up from the resource center that evening, I couldn't contain my excitement. She was helping Mrs. Valdez, an elderly woman who'd been struggling with citizenship paperwork, understand a particularly complex immigration form when I arrived. I watched through the window as Sophia patiently explained each section, her Spanish fluid and natural as she translated legal terminology into words Mrs. Valdez could understand. "Mija," Mrs. Valdez said, patting Sophia's hand as they finished. "You're going to be a wonderful lawyer someday. You have the heart for it." The drive home was quiet at first. Sophia seemed lost in thought, probably still processing whatever case she'd been working on that afternoon. She'd developed this habit of carrying other people's problems with her, turning them over in her mind until she found some way to help, or at least understand what they were going through. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the news I was bursting to share. "Good," she said, then paused. "Actually, really good. Mrs. Valdez finally got approval for her citizenship application. We've been working on it for 8 months, and today the letter came through." She cried when I read it to her. That was Sophia, more excited about an elderly woman's citizenship success than she would be about her own achievements. It was the kind of selfless joy that made me incredibly proud and incredibly worried at the same time, because I knew the world wasn't always kind to people who cared more about others than themselves. "Sophia," I said, pulling into our driveway, "I got a call from Principal Morrison today." She looked at me with those perceptive eyes that had always seemed to see more than they should. "About what?" "You've been selected as valedictorian." For a moment, she didn't react at all. Just sat there processing the information with that careful thoughtfulness that had characterized her entire approach to life. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Not the loud, exuberant celebration you might expect from a teenager receiving such momentous news, but something quieter and deeper. "Really?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Really? You get to give the commencement speech. You'll be speaking to the entire graduating class, all the families, the faculty, everyone." She nodded slowly, and I could see her mind, already working, already thinking about what this opportunity meant and what she might want to say. "When do I need to have the speech ready?" "You have about 6 weeks to prepare. Principal Morrison said they'll want to review it beforehand, but he seemed confident that whatever you write will be perfect." That night, I watched Sophia disappear into her room with a notebook and her laptop, and I knew she was beginning the process that would define everything that came next. She approached the speech the same way she approached everything else, with meticulous research, careful consideration, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Over the following weeks, I caught glimpses of her preparation. She'd spread books across her desk, everything from famous speeches by civil rights leaders to philosophical texts about justice and democracy. She filled notebook after notebook with quotes and ideas, crossing out lines and rewriting passages until her handwriting became an illegible maze of thoughts and revisions. "What are you going to talk about?" I asked her one evening, finding her surrounded by research materials. She looked up from her laptop, where she'd been typing and deleting the same paragraph for what looked like the 100th time. "I'm not sure yet. I mean, I know what I want to say, but I'm trying to figure out how to say it in a way that matters." "What do you want to say?" She was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I want to talk about what it means to belong somewhere. About the difference between being invited and being welcomed. About how sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who make you feel like you have to earn your place at their table." My heart stopped. She knew. Of course she knew. For 17 years I'd tried to shield her from the worst of Eleanor's rejections, but Sophia had been watching and absorbing and understanding far more than I'd given her credit for. "Baby," I started, but she held up a hand. "I'm not angry," she said. "At least not in the way you think. I'm grateful, actually. Growing up the way I did, always having to prove myself, always being the outsider looking in, it taught me things that my cousins will never understand. It made me stronger." She turned back to her laptop, then paused. "And it gave me something to say that might actually matter to people who are listening." 3 weeks before graduation, Sophia finished her first draft. She didn't let me read it, but I could see the intensity in her face when she worked on it, the way she'd sit perfectly still for minutes at a time, just thinking, before typing furiously for several paragraphs. Whatever she was writing, it was coming from somewhere deep and honest and powerful. The final version was completed a week before the ceremony. She printed it out on our home printer, the pages crisp and clean, her words formatted with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything else. She folded the speech carefully and tucked it into the leather portfolio I'd given her for Christmas, the one she'd been using to carry her college acceptance letters. "Are you nervous?" I asked her the night before graduation. She considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I've been waiting my whole life to say these things. I'm ready." And looking at her face, seeing the calm determination in her eyes, I knew she was. Whatever she planned to say on that stage, it was going to be something that no one in the audience would forget, especially not the family members who'd spent 17 years convincing themselves that she didn't quite measure up to their standards. Eleanor Harrington was about to discover exactly what she'd been dismissing all these years, and I had a feeling. It was going to be a revelation that changed everything. The week leading up to graduation felt like holding my breath underwater. Everything moved with that strange, suspended quality that comes before moments you know will change everything, when the air itself seems charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. Sophia moved through those final days with a calm that was almost unsettling, as if she'd already played out every possible scenario in her mind and made peace with whatever consequences might follow. On Monday, I sent out the graduation details to the entire Harrington family, just as I had, for every important event over the past 18 years. The email was carefully worded, professional and warm, including the time, location, and a note about Sophia being selected as valedictorian. I attached the official announcement from the school, thinking that seeing it in print from the principal himself might somehow make it more real, more worthy of acknowledgement. I hit send at 10:47 a.m. and then spent the rest of the day checking my phone obsessively, waiting for responses that never came. No congratulations, no expressions of pride, not even a simple, "We'll be there." just silence that stretched on hour after hour until it became its own kind of answer. By Wednesday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called Marcus's sister Jennifer, thinking that surely someone in the family would want to celebrate this milestone. Jennifer had always been the most approachable of the siblings, the one who seemed genuinely fond of Sophia, even if she never went out of her way to include her. "Oh, congratulations," Jennifer said when I told her about the valedictorian honor, but her voice carried that particular tone of surprise that suggested she hadn't actually read my email. "That's wonderful news. Sophia always was a smart girl." Smart girl. As if academic excellence was a cute personality quirk, rather than the result of years of dedicated work and natural brilliance. As if being valedictorian was equivalent to winning a participation trophy. "Will you and Robert be able to make it to the ceremony?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light despite the growing knot in my stomach. There was a pause, the kind of hesitation that always preceded a politely worded rejection. "Well, we'd love to, of course, but Robert has that medical conference in Atlanta that weekend, and Caroline has her riding competition on Saturday morning. You know how these things pile up at the end of the school year." I did know. I knew that. Caroline's riding competition was a local event that would be finished by noon, leaving plenty of time to drive the 20 minutes to Sophia's school. I knew that Robert's conference didn't start until Sunday, because Sophia had mentioned seeing it listed in the newspaper's events section. But I also knew that pointing out these inconsistencies would only make me look desperate and petty. "Of course," I said. "These things do get busy." The conversation with Christopher went similarly, though he at least had the courtesy to sound genuinely regretful. "We've got the twins' dance recital that afternoon," he explained. "Angela's been helping with costumes for weeks, and you know how important these things are to 12-year-olds. David didn't even return my call. His secretary left a voicemail explaining that he was traveling for business and wouldn't be available until the following week. Business travel that had somehow been scheduled for the exact weekend when his brother's daughter was graduating as valedictorian of her class. By Thursday, the pattern was clear. The family had collectively decided that Sophia's graduation wasn't worth rearranging their schedules for, wasn't significant enough to warrant the kind of effort they'd made for Tommy's tennis tournaments or Caroline's debutante preparations. They were sending a message as clear as any words they might have spoken. This achievement, like all of Sophia's achievements, simply didn't matter to them. That evening, I found Sophia in the kitchen making herself a late dinner after her final volunteer shift at the resource center. She'd been putting in extra hours all week, helping families complete last-minute paperwork before the summer break, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "How was your day?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Good," she said, picking at her salad without much enthusiasm. "We helped 3 families today. Mrs. Chen finally got her work permit approved, and the Morales family found out they qualified for reduced-fee citizenship applications." She paused, then looked up at me with those perceptive eyes that never missed anything. "Has anyone responded to your email about graduation?" I'd been dreading this conversation, hoping somehow that I could spare her from knowing how completely her own family planned to ignore her biggest moment. But Sophia had always been too intelligent to fool, too observant to shield from uncomfortable truths. "A few people have scheduling conflicts," I said carefully. She nodded slowly, processing this information with the same analytical approach she brought to everything else. "All of them?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized there was no point in pretending anymore. Sophia had spent 17 years watching the family dynamics, understanding exactly where she stood in their hierarchy of priorities. She didn't need me to protect her from what she already knew. "Yes," I said quietly. "All of them." For a moment, she didn't react. Then she set down her fork and looked directly at me. "Good." "Good?" "I mean it, Mom. I'm glad they won't be there." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself worthy of their attention, their approval, their investment. And now, finally, I get to say what I want to say without worrying about their reaction. She stood up and started clearing her dishes, moving with the efficient grace that characterized everything she did. Besides, the people who matter will be there. You'll be there. Mrs. Patterson will be there. Mr. Rodriguez from the Resource Center said he's bringing his whole family because he wants his kids to see what success looks like. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation, about the quiet strength in Sophia's voice when she said she was glad the family wouldn't be attending. Part of me was proud of her resilience, her ability to find value in herself that didn't depend on external validation. But another part of me was heartbroken that she'd had to develop that kind of emotional armor in the first place. Friday afternoon brought one final disappointment. Marcus came home from work looking uncomfortable, carrying the kind of tension that always preceded difficult conversations about his family. "My mother called," he said without preamble. I waited, though I could already guess what was coming. She wanted to know if we were making a big production out of the graduation ceremony. She said she hoped we understood that with everything going on with the family business lately, it wouldn't be appropriate for her to attend something that might draw too much attention. Too much attention. As if Sophia's academic achievement was somehow embarrassing, something that needed to be hidden rather than celebrated. As if being proud of our daughter's success was a social faux pas that might reflect poorly on the family's reputation. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. Marcus looked down at his hands. I told her that Sophia was valedictorian, that this was one of the most important days of her life, and that her grandmother should be there. And? She said she'd consider it. Consider it. 18 years of watching our daughter grow into an extraordinary young woman, and Eleanor would consider whether her granddaughter's graduation was worth her time. That evening, Sophia practiced her speech one final time in front of her bedroom mirror. I could hear her voice through the door, strong and clear and completely confident. Whatever she planned to say on that stage, she was ready. More than ready. She was determined. Saturday. Morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. As I helped Sophia with her cap and gown, adjusting the honor cords that marked her academic achievements, I felt a mixture of pride and anticipation that made my hands shake slightly. "Are you nervous?" I asked her, the same question I'd been asking all week. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time, then turned to face me with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "No," she said. "I've been waiting my whole life for this moment. I'm not nervous, I'm free." And looking at her standing there in her graduation regalia, holding the speech that would change everything, I knew she was right. Today wasn't about seeking approval or earning acceptance from people who had already shown their true colors. Today was about Sophia finally having the platform to speak her truth, regardless of who was listening. Whether the Harrington family chose to witness it or not. The auditorium at Millbrook Heights High School was packed beyond capacity, filled with families who had come to celebrate their children's achievements on what everyone knew would be one of the most important days of their young lives. The air buzzed with excitement, cameras flashing, proud parents adjusting their positions to get better views of the stage where their graduates would soon be receiving their diplomas. I sat in the third row, having arrived early to secure a good seat, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Marcus sat beside me, unusually quiet, checking his phone periodically as if he might receive some last-minute message that would change everything. But I knew no one was coming. The two empty seats beside us, seats I'd optimistically reserved, for Eleanor and whichever family member might have decided to join her, remained stubbornly vacant as the ceremony began. The opening procession was everything you'd expect from a high school graduation: proud teachers in academic regalia, school board members looking appropriately solemn, and finally, the graduating class filing in. With that mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with crossing major life thresholds, when Sophia appeared, walking with the measured pace required by ceremony protocol, she looked absolutely radiant. Her cap sat perfectly on her dark hair, which she'd styled in loose waves that caught the auditorium lights. The honor cords draped. Across her shoulders marked her academic achievements: National Honor Society, Spanish Honor Society, outstanding achievement in social studies. But it was her expression that took my breath away. She wasn't nervous or overwhelmed or seeking approval from the audience. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was and what she intended to do with the platform she'd earned. Principal Morrison began the ceremony with the usual remarks about achievement and potential, about the class of 2024 being prepared to change the world. He introduced the school board president, who delivered a mercifully brief speech about the importance of education in developing responsible citizens. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "it is my great pleasure to introduce our valedictorian, Miss Sophia Rodriguez Harrington, who will be attending Georgetown University in the fall to pursue her studies in international relations and human rights law." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, but I barely heard it. All my attention was focused on my daughter as she approached the podium with confident steps, her speech folder held securely in her hands. She adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. All those presentations at the Resource Center had prepared her well for public speaking, and looked out at the audience with that calm, assessing gaze that had always made her seem older than her years. "Good evening," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Principal Morrison, faculty, families, and fellow graduates, thank you for the honor of speaking to you tonight." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the crowd, and I could see her taking in the faces before her: classmates who had watched her excel for 4 years, teachers who had nurtured her intellectual growth, families who had come to celebrate not just their own children, but the collective achievement of the entire class. 4 years ago, when we started high school, someone told me that success was about fitting in, about finding your place in the existing order and making yourself comfortable there. Tonight, I want to talk to you about a different kind of success, the kind that comes not from fitting in, but from standing up. The audience grew noticeably quieter, sensing that this would not be a typical graduation speech filled with platitudes about bright futures and endless possibilities. "I've learned something important during my time at Millbrook Heights High School," Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I've learned that your worth is not determined by other people's willingness to recognize it. Your value doesn't depend on whether you receive invitations to exclusive events, or whether your achievements make it into family newsletters, or whether people think you deserve investment in your future." I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was really going to do it. She was going to speak her truth to everyone, regardless of the consequences. Some of us are born into families where love is conditional, where acceptance must be earned through conformity, where being one of us requires abandoning parts of yourself that don't fit someone else's vision of who you should be. Her voice carried no bitterness, no anger, just the clear, unwavering tone of someone stating facts that could no longer be ignored. I want to speak directly to the students in this audience who have felt like outsiders in their own families, who have been told they're not quite enough, not quite worthy, not quite deserving of the same opportunities given freely to others. I want you to know that their inability to see your worth is not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their limitations. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. Everyone seemed to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after typical graduation platitudes were forgotten. For 17 years, I have watched family members receive support and encouragement and financial investment while being told that I didn't quite qualify for the same consideration. I was told that my dreams were impractical, that my interests were too removed from what really mattered, that my background made me unsuitable for certain opportunities. She paused, and I could see her gathering herself for what came next. 3. Weeks ago, I was specifically told that I was not worthy of my family's college fund because I wasn't a real family member. Because my hyphenated name and my mother's working-class background and my passion for social justice somehow disqualified me from being considered deserving of investment. A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the audience. This was not what anyone had expected from a valedictorian speech, but no one seemed inclined to look away. But here's what I want everyone in this room to understand, especially those of you who have felt dismissed or undervalued or told you weren't enough. Their rejection is not your reality. Their limitations are not your limitations. Their inability to recognize excellence does not diminish your excellence. Her voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with the kind of passionate conviction that comes from speaking deep truth. I am graduating as valedictorian of this class with a 4.0 GPA. I have been accepted to Georgetown Northwestern and Duke universities with significant scholarships. Harvard Law School has personally invited me to apply, with guaranteed admission upon completion of my undergraduate degree. I have worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center, contributed to federal court research, and helped dozens of families navigate complex legal systems through my volunteer work. She paused to let these achievements sink in, and I could see people in the audience sitting up straighter, realizing they were listening to someone truly exceptional. I accomplished all of this not because I had family support or financial advantages or social connections. I accomplished this because I refused to let other people's low expectations become my ceiling. I accomplished this because I understood that my worth was not up for negotiation. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Even Principal Morrison, standing off to the side, seemed transfixed by what he was hearing. To my fellow graduates, especially those of you who have felt like outsiders or underdogs or somehow less than, remember this moment. Remember that success is not about earning approval from people who have already decided you're not worthy of it. Success is about defining your own worth and then living up to that definition with everything you have. She looked directly into the audience then, and though I knew she couldn't see me clearly with the stage lights in her eyes, I felt like she was speaking directly to me. To the families here tonight, love your children for who they are, not who you think they should be. Invest in their dreams, even if those dreams don't match your vision of success. Some of the most remarkable achievements come from the most unexpected places. And then, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the auditorium, she delivered the line that would be quoted in newspapers and shared on social media for weeks to come. You cannot break what was never fragile. You cannot diminish what was never dependent on your approval. And you cannot stop what was always meant to rise. The applause began slowly, scattered clapping from various parts of the audience, and then built into something thunderous and sustained. People rose to their feet, first a few, then entire sections, until the whole auditorium was standing and applauding with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for championship victories. I was crying before I realized it, tears streaming down my face as I watched my daughter stand at that podium, completely composed, completely confident, having just delivered the most powerful speech I'd ever heard. She had taken every rejection, every dismissal, every casual cruelty, and transformed them into something beautiful and strong and undeniably true. As the applause continued, I noticed something else. In the back corner of the auditorium, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood a familiar figure in a navy dress and pearls. Eleanor Harrington had come after all, and the expression on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen there before. It wasn't pride, exactly, and it certainly wasn't approval. It was something much more complex: shock, recognition, and what might have been the first stirring of respect for the granddaughter she had spent 17 years trying to diminish. But it didn't matter anymore. Sophia hadn't spoken those words for Eleanor's benefit or for anyone else's approval. She had spoken them because they needed to be said, because truth has its own power, and because sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and be counted when it matters most. The aftermath of Sophia's speech unfolded like ripples in a pond, each wave carrying her words further into places we never could have anticipated. Within hours, videos of her address were circulating on social media, shared by proud teachers, inspired classmates, and strangers who recognized something powerful in her message about self-worth and resilience. The immediate response was overwhelming. As families filed out of the auditorium after the diploma ceremony, person after person approached us to express how deeply Sophia's words had affected them. Mrs. Chen, whose work permit approval Sophia had helped secure, brought her entire extended family to meet the young woman who speaks truth with such courage. Mr. Rodriguez from the Resource Center stood with tears in his eyes, telling everyone within earshot that Sophia was going to change the world someday. But perhaps the most meaningful reaction came from Sophia's classmates themselves. Sarah Martinez, who had struggled with her own family's disapproval of her plans to study art instead of business, hugged Sophia tightly and whispered, "Thank you for saying what I've never been brave enough to say." David Kim, whose parents had always compared him unfavorably to his older brother, shook her hand formally and said, "You made me realize I don't have to keep apologizing for being myself." Marcus stood beside me throughout these conversations, his face a mixture of pride and something that looked like regret. I could see him processing what his daughter had accomplished, not just academically, but emotionally. The strength it had taken to stand on that stage and speak those truths, knowing that every word would be scrutinized and judged by people whose approval she'd once desperately wanted. As the crowd began to thin, I noticed Eleanor still standing in the back corner of the auditorium, no longer hiding behind the pillar, but not approaching either. She seemed frozen, uncertain, watching the stream of people congratulating Sophia with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. For the first time in 18 years, Eleanor Harrington looked like someone who had misjudged a situation so completely that she didn't know how to proceed. When Sophia finally broke free from the well-wishers and walked over to us, her face was flushed with excitement and exhaustion. The adrenaline of the moment was beginning to wear off, and I could see the full weight of what she'd done settling on her shoulders. "How do you feel?" I asked, wrapping her in a hug that I hoped conveyed everything I couldn't put into words. "Free," she said, the same word she'd used that morning, but with even deeper meaning now. Like I finally said everything I've been holding inside for years. Marcus pulled her into his own embrace, and I heard him whisper, "I'm sorry I never said those things for you. You shouldn't have had to stand up there alone." Sophia pulled back to look at him, her expression gentle but firm. "Dad, I wasn't alone. I've never been alone. Mom taught me that my worth doesn't depend on other people's approval, and you taught me that integrity matters more than keeping the peace. I had everything I needed." It was then that Eleanor finally approached, moving slowly across the auditorium, floor like someone walking toward an uncertain fate. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of everything she'd heard. When she reached us, she stood for a moment without speaking, her usual commanding presence replaced by something that might have been humility. "Sophia," she said, finally, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. That was quite a speech." "Thank you for coming, grandmother," Sophia replied, her tone polite but not particularly warm. "I wasn't sure you would." Eleanor flinched slightly at the word grandmother, as if she was hearing it for the first time and realizing what it actually meant. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I thought it might be difficult." "Difficult for whom?" Sophia asked, not unkindly, but with the directness that had always made adults uncomfortable. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in her life, she seemed to realize that the honest answer to that question would reveal more about her own character than she was prepared to acknowledge publicly. "I want you to know," Eleanor said instead, "that I heard what you said tonight. All of it." "Good," Sophia replied simply. It needed to be said. The conversation that followed was brief and awkward, filled with the kind of careful politeness that occurs when people are trying to navigate completely changed territory. Eleanor asked about Sophia's college plans, listened to details about her scholarship offers, and expressed what sounded like genuine surprise at the scope of her granddaughter's achievements. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years of dismissal or the casual cruelty of the college fund rejection. No recognition that Sophia's success had been accomplished not just without family support, but in spite of active discouragement. Eleanor was impressed, perhaps even proud, but she wasn't transformed. People don't change that fundamentally, that quickly, no matter how powerful the catalyst. And that was okay. Because the most important part of Sophia's speech hadn't been about changing Eleanor's mind or earning her belated approval. It had been about claiming her own voice, defining her own worth, and refusing to let other people's limitations become her reality. In the days that followed, the ripple effects continued to spread. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Sophia's address, calling it a graduation speech that challenges us all to examine how we define worth and belonging. The piece was picked up by larger papers, and suddenly my daughter was being contacted by organizations across the country who wanted to share her message with their own communities. College scholarship committees took notice. Georgetown called to offer additional financial support, impressed not just by her academic achievements, but by her demonstrated leadership and moral courage. A civil rights organization in Washington reached out about summer internship opportunities. A publisher expressed interest in working with Sophia to develop her ideas into a book about resilience and self-advocacy. But perhaps the most meaningful response came in the form of letters, hundreds of them, from young people across the country who had seen video of her speech online and felt compelled to reach out. They wrote about their own experiences with conditional love, with being made to feel not quite enough, with struggling to maintain their sense of self-worth in families or communities that didn't value who they really were. "Your speech saved my life," wrote a 17-year-old from Oregon whose parents had rejected her for being gay. "I was ready to give up, but hearing you talk about not letting other people's limitations become your limitations made me realize I have more to offer the world than their opinion of me." A college freshman from Texas wrote, "I've been trying to become someone my family would be proud of for so long that I forgot who I actually was. Your speech reminded me that their pride isn't worth losing myself." Reading these letters together became our new evening routine. Sophia would sit at the kitchen table, carefully responding to each one with the same thoughtfulness she'd always brought to her volunteer work at the resource center. She understood that her speech had given voice to something many people had been feeling but couldn't articulate, and she took that responsibility seriously. "I keep thinking about something," she told me one evening as she sealed another response letter. "All these people writing to say they felt alone, like they were the only ones dealing with families who made them feel unworthy. But there are so many of us. We've been isolated, thinking our experiences were unique, when really we're part of this huge community of people who've had to learn to validate themselves." That insight became the foundation for everything that came next. Sophia started a blog called Letters to My Younger Self, where she shared stories from the people who had written to her, along with resources for young people struggling with similar issues. The blog grew quickly, attracting attention from educators, counselors, and advocacy organizations who recognized its potential to help people feel less alone in their struggles. By the time she left for Georgetown that fall, Sophia had transformed a graduation speech into a movement. She'd shown that speaking your truth, even when it's difficult, even when it challenges people you love, even when the consequences are uncertain, can create space for others to find their own voices. Looking back now, I realized that graduation day marked the end of one chapter in our lives and the beginning of something entirely different. For 17 years, we had been seeking acceptance from people who were never going to offer it unconditionally. From that moment forward, we were building something new, a definition of family and worth and belonging that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Eleanor never did apologize for the college fund rejection or acknowledge that she'd been wrong about Sophia's potential. But she did start including Sophia's achievements in her monthly family newsletters, and she did mention her granddaughter's Georgetown acceptance to her bridge club friends. It wasn't the dramatic transformation that movies might suggest, but it was movement in the right direction. More importantly, it didn't matter anymore. Sophia had found her voice and used it to help others find theirs. She'd proved that you don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up and tell the truth about what you've experienced. That truth, spoken clearly and without apology, had changed not just our family, but the lives of countless others who had been waiting for someone to say what they'd been feeling all along. You are enough, exactly as you are, regardless of who does or doesn't recognize it. 2 years have passed since that graduation day, and I'm writing this from Sophia's dorm room at Georgetown University, where I've just helped her move into her junior year apartment. The walls are covered with photos from her internships, certificates from her human rights advocacy work, and thank you letters from families she's helped through her continued volunteer work with immigrant communities in Washington, D.C. She's become everything I always knew she could be, but more than that, she's become someone who understands that her success isn't just personal achievement, it's a platform for lifting others up. Last month, she testified before a congressional subcommittee about immigration reform. Her voice is clear and confident as it was on that graduation stage. The girl who was once told she wasn't worthy of her family's investment is now helping to shape national policy. But the most remarkable thing about Sophia's journey isn't her external accomplishments, impressive as they are. It's the way she's maintained her compassion and humility despite having every reason to become bitter or resentful. She still sends Eleanor birthday cards. She still attends family gatherings when her schedule permits. She's never used her platform to publicly shame the people who dismissed her. Instead, she's focused entirely on helping others find their own strength. That's the lesson I want to share with anyone who's listening to this story. Anyone who has felt overlooked or undervalued or told they weren't quite enough. Your worth was never actually up for debate. The people who couldn't see your value were limited by their own vision, not by any deficiency in you. And when you finally understand that truth, really understand it in your bones, it sets you free to become who you were always meant to be. The college fund that Eleanor deemed Sophia unworthy of receiving? It still exists, though none of the other grandchildren have accessed it yet. Tommy finished his first year at Riverside Academy with mediocre grades and a drinking problem that required family intervention. Caroline dropped out of her debutante preparations after deciding she wanted to study marine biology instead of finding a suitable husband. The real Harrington grandchildren are struggling to figure out who they are when they're not performing for approval. Meanwhile, Sophia has never asked for a penny from that fund. She's earned her way through college with scholarships and work-study programs, just as she always planned. But more importantly, she's learned something that money can't buy: the confidence that comes from knowing you've built your success on your own terms, without compromising your values or apologizing for who you are. Last Christmas, something remarkable happened at the family gathering. Eleanor, now 84 and beginning to show signs of the softening that sometimes comes with age, asked Sophia to say grace before dinner. It was a small gesture, but significant in the context of our family dynamics. For the first time, Eleanor was acknowledging Sophia not as a guest or an obligation, but as someone whose voice had value, whose words were worth hearing. Sophia's prayer was simple and beautiful, thanking God for the food we were about to share, for the roof over our heads, and for the opportunity to gather together despite our differences. She asked for blessings on family members who were struggling, for wisdom in times of conflict, and for the courage to love each other even when we don't always understand each other. When she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. Then Eleanor, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, said, "Thank you, Sophia. That was lovely." It wasn't an apology for 17 years of dismissal. It wasn't an acknowledgement of how wrong she'd been about Sophia's character and potential. But it was recognition. And sometimes recognition is enough. Sometimes being seen clearly, even late in the game, is its own form of healing. After dinner, I found myself talking with Jennifer about how much Sophia had grown and changed since high school. "She's become so confident," Jennifer observed. "So sure of herself. I remember when she was little, she always seemed so serious, like she was carrying the weight of the world." I smiled, thinking about the quiet little girl who used to sit on the porch steps reading books about justice and human rights while her cousins played games that didn't interest her. "She wasn't carrying the weight of the world," I said. "She was preparing to change it, and that's exactly what she's doing." The blog she started after graduation has evolved into a nonprofit organization that provides resources and support for young people who are struggling with family rejection or conditional love. She speaks regularly at high schools and colleges, sharing her story and helping others understand that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Just last week, she called me from campus, excited about a letter she'd received from a young man in rural Alabama whose family had disowned him for wanting to become a teacher instead of taking over the family farm. He'd seen one of her speeches online and decided to apply for college anyway, despite having no family support. He'd been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships. "Mom," Sophia said, her voice bright with joy. "He said my speech taught him that he didn't need permission to pursue his dreams. He's going to be the first person in his family to graduate from college, and he's going to become the kind of teacher who sees potential in kids that everyone else overlooks." That's the real measure of Sophia's success, not the scholarships or the internships or the recognition, but the ripple effects of her courage. Every person who finds their voice because she found hers, every young person who refuses to accept someone else's limitations as their own reality, every family that learns to love more unconditionally because they heard her story, that's her true legacy. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own experience, I want you to know something. You are not broken. You are not less than. You are not unworthy of investment or love or recognition. The people who can't see your value are operating with limited vision, and their limitations are not your reality. Maybe you're the parent of a child who doesn't fit the mold you expected, whose dreams seem impractical or whose interests don't align with your vision of success. I'm here to tell you that your job isn't to shape your child into someone else's definition of worthy. It's to love them fiercely and support them completely as they become who they're meant to be. Maybe you're the young person who's been told, "You're not quite enough, not quite deserving, not quite worthy of the same opportunities others receive freely." I'm here to tell you that their inability to see your potential is not evidence of your limitations. It's evidence of theirs. Your worth is not up for negotiation. Your dreams are not too big or too impractical or too removed from what really matters. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your potential matters, regardless of who does or doesn't recognize it. The most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let other people's limitations become your ceiling. Stand up, speak your truth, claim your space in this world, and watch how your courage creates space for others to do the same. Because here's what I've learned from watching my remarkable daughter navigate 17 years of subtle rejection and emerge stronger, kinder, and more determined than ever. You cannot break what was never fragile. You cannot diminish what was never dependent on approval. And you cannot stop what was always meant to rise. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own journey, or helped you see your situation more clearly, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're enough, exactly as they are. Share it with parents who might need to examine how they define worth and belonging. Share it with young people who are struggling to value themselves in families or communities that don't see their potential. Every time you share a story like this, every time you choose courage over comfort, every time you refuse to accept someone else's limited vision as your reality, you're contributing to a world where worth is inherent, where love is unconditional, where belonging isn't something you have to earn, but something you claim by virtue of being beautifully, imperfectly, perfectly human. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being exactly who you are, regardless of who does or doesn't recognize your worth. The world needs your voice, your gifts, your unique perspective on what it means to be human. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.